Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm one of your hosts, Katie Halper.
I'm the second host, Aaron Matte. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us for another week. The school year has begun, and let's see how many students are going to be muzzled this fall for speaking up for Palestine. That's kind of one of the big questions over this school year.
Yeah, muzzled, arrested, physically attacked. Who knows?
Yeah.
So many choices for our repressive state apparatus to choose from.
And to throw in just more intrigue to the American school system, you also have to deal with regular school shootings, as we just saw in Georgia.
Oh, right.
So, what a wild time. Anyway, welcome to fall. Welcome to Useful Idiots for another week. Our website is usefulidiotspodcast.com. Go there, support the show, and get bonus content.
Yeah. And for Democrats Suck, let's take a look at Jake Sullivan. You know, we have been obviously justifiably speaking a lot about Israel, Palestine, the genocide going on there, the United States complicity in it. But the United States is also complicit in other wars, and that includes the great proxy war between Russia and the United States, basically, that is being carried out in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Let's take a look at what Jake Sullivan had to say about what is happening in that region right now.
Yes, Keith Bridge for the New York Times. Have you made any progress with China in discussing what might be a possible resolution for the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
I can't say that we did make progress on that issue. The PRC has been very public in its view that the war should end through diplomacy. They've laid out various principles, both.
What a strange view.
I know.
For the PRC to lay out there. The war should end through diplomacy.
Yeah, the People's Republic of China is really weird.
Yeah. So rather than have two sides kill each other and grind each other down and sacrifice, hundreds of thousands more people, they should talk, aka engage in diplomacy. And for Jake Sullivan, that's like some strange foreign concept. Like that's like saying that, doctors have been very clear in their view that people should drink water, to survive,
Right.
We all have different approaches to the world, and the U.S. approach includes being hostile to the concept of diplomacy. It's refreshing to see an admission.
I know. That's what I was thinking, actually. It is refreshingly honest to say, no, we're not making progress because obstacles like China attempting diplomacy are getting in the way of progress.
The Chinese have been very clear in their view that they don't want to see nuclear war.
Yeah.
We have a different opinion, but we respect our differences, and we understand that China has a different approach to the world, and that's what this world is all about, is living with people who don't share our views that diplomacy is bad and nuclear war is bad.
For different folks, yeah. China must be thrilled that they're that he's unintentionally praising them.
Unilaterally and in separate communication with the Brazilians. We had the opportunity to exchange views on the war against Ukraine over the course of the last 3 days. We didn't reach any particular plan with respect to diplomacy, in large part because the United States very rigorously adheres to the simple maxim of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So ultimately, it will be up to Ukraine to decide how it wants to proceed with diplomacy and negotiations.
Oh, what a truth teller Jake Sullivan is. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. They will not impose diplomacy on Ukraine. We know that the Biden administration really believes in Ukrainian sovereignty, which is why they got in the way of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that could have, of course, ended this war and saved thousands of lives.
Yeah, look, Jake Sullivan omits, and he's helped out in this by the U.S. media, which never talks about the fact that Russia and Ukraine negotiated a peace deal more than 2 years ago, back in April 2022. The premise was basically Ukraine would declare neutrality, which, contrary to people thinking that's some radical demand, that was actually enshrined in Ukraine's founding state constitution. So Russia was simply asking that Ukraine revert to its founding documents. And in exchange for that, Russia would withdraw to its pre-invasion lines, and there'd be some sort of arrangement worked out for Crimea and the Donbass, right? We all know what happened. The U.S. blocked that. or the U.S. opposed that. But even publicly, they said, like, they undermined Jake Sullivan's talking point that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Because, for example, Ukraine, back at this time when this deal was being negotiated, they asked the U.S. and other states for security guarantees to like underpin this agreement with Russia. And this was the U.S. and NATO's response, as captured by a headline at the time in the Washington Post. NATO says Ukraine to decide on peace deal with Russia within limits. Okay. So what NATO is saying, and by NATO, they mean the U.S., that there were limits on what the U.S. would allow Ukraine to decide to make peace. And those limits included that the U.S. was not going to basically let Ukraine make peace with Russia. So Jake Sullivan says nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but that headline at the time was much more accurate because they're saying actually Ukraine can decide within limits. And basically those limits included not being allowed to make peace with Russia.
Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine within limits is actually the policy.
That's exactly what it was. And we all forget that. Around that same time, in late March of 2022, NATO even got a hold of the draft peace treaty that was being negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. And there was a meeting in Brussels, which Joe Biden attended. And this is according to the New York Times. It came out recently. The president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, he held up a text of the proposed treaty. And he said, would any of you sign this? He was outraged that this treaty was being negotiated. And nobody in the room said yes. So they were basically saying that on Ukraine's behalf, they were going to reject the peace treaty that Ukraine was then negotiating. So this idea of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine it's a complete lie, because quietly behind the scenes, they all rejected the peace deal that Ukraine negotiated. And they've been helped along in their rejectionism because U.S. media just never reports this stuff, or at least doesn't highlight it very loudly. And of course, if we get the truth, it comes out as recently happened with the New York Times more than 2 years later.
But it's not like there's any urgency to this. It's not like it could have saved lives.
Yeah, no. And the latest news is from Ukraine. So, Ukraine tried to leverage its invasion into Kursk, into Russia's Kursk region, by showing Biden like, hey, look what we're doing to Putin. We're really humiliating him. Now, can we get your permission to use U.S. missiles for long-range strikes into Russia?
Right.
And as has always been the case, first the Biden administration said no, right? We saw that before with ATACMS and cluster bombs and F-16s. And then Biden's like, you know what? Maybe things have changed a little bit. We'll reconsider. And now, according to Reuters just reported this week that actually, lo and behold, the Biden administration is likely going to give Ukraine this permission. So that's the latest step on the escalation ladder that we're onto now. And everyone's just kind of like, no big deal.
So it's so great that the U.S. isn't diplomatically oriented the way China is.
Yeah. Those Chinese that don't understand that diplomacy is
the enemy.
Yeah, war. So basically, like nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine means no diplomacy with Ukraine, only war with Ukraine. That's, I think, what that means in real life.
Right.
So thank you, Jake Sullivan, for laying it out.
Thank you for your partial honesty.
Okay, for Republicans suck, let's turn to J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee for Republicans. Not giving Trump, I think, the boost he expected out of J.D. Vance. I'm not sure what he thought in bringing in a senator who's like barely been elected to office, and doesn't have huge name recognition, and has some views I agree with when it comes to, for example, being critical of the proxy war in Ukraine. But domestically, man, not much, I think, to love. And he was asked about what can be done to curb the cost of daycare in the U.S. And this was his response.
What can we do about lowering the cost of daycare? Hayden, obviously a working family, and it's very hard for working families to get by. How will we lower the cost of daycare?
Yeah, such an important question, Charlie. And I think one of the things that we can do is make it easier for family models to choose, or for families to choose whatever model they want, right? So one of the ways that you might be able to relieve a little bit of pressure on people who are paying so much for daycare is make it so that maybe like grandma or grandpa wants to help out a little bit more, or maybe there's an aunt or uncle that wants to help out a little bit more. If that happens, you relieve some of the pressure on all the resources that we're spending in daycare.
All right, so I didn't know this. So there are so many relatives who want to look after kids, but somehow the government is standing in the way. So if only they knew, if only grandma and grandpa knew from JD Vance that they have permission, I guess, to look after the kid,
Right.
then problem solved. Then we don't have to worry about daycare costs at all. Just
Right.
let's bring in grandma and grandpa or an uncle and aunt.
Yeah, I mean, people have never thought about this until JD Vance suggested it. He really thinks outside the box. Obviously, people, if grandma and grandpa and aunt and uncle aren't already helping out, it's because they didn't hear this idea from JD Vance.
There we go.
There
Now,
we
in
go.
fairness to JD Vance, in the clip, he goes on to say also we can increase access for people so they don't have to have such educational burdens, like such a high threshold of education to be able to look after kids. That's his other idea. So basically make it easier for people who want to be professionals in the daycare realm to do it rather than have such a high education burden. But how about, I don't know, doing something like universal pre-K, which is what happened in New York, and but I guess that's too communist for them. It's hard when you don't want to spend any money on social welfare programs, the box you put yourself in.
Right.
It's very
Really
difficult.
ties your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody say that does anybody in New York say that universal pre-K has been a bad thing? It's got nothing but rave reviews that I've seen. I'd love to hear the argument against it if there is one. It seems like these programs work where what you do is you invest state resources in services that help people and ease the burden on working people, and so they don't have to worry about getting an extra job or whatever else. I mean, that seems to be the method that works. But if you're a Republican and you're allergic to social services, that's not an option.
Well, let's turn to Isn't That Weird? And I think that instead of setting this up, let's just turn to the videotape.
A professional soccer game was suspended in Norway when fans threw fish cakes and other objects onto the field to protest the use of a video assistant referee, or VAR. The Norwegian Eliteserien game between Rosenborg BK and Lillestrøm was initially stopped mere minutes after kickoff due to the fish cakes raining down on the field. Play eventually resumed, but fans from both sides continued to throw fish cakes and started adding tennis balls and smoke bombs into the mix. The game was officially suspended after just 32 minutes of play, with the score tied at 0-0. Some fans at the game were seen holding a banner which read, "We will never give up, VAR will go away."
That is some impassioned activism right there. Never going to give up, because video assisted refereeing is, I guess, really problematic for sports fans. And I just want to give these people a shout out for not just going with fish cakes, but ramping it up to other weapons, stink bombs, for instance.
I mean, this recalls for me Chomsky's observation that sports diverts people's genuine need to be a part of a community and to be active and trying to improve their community, and it exploits that need by diverting it into completely useless endeavors like being obsessed with sports outcomes and the way the rule, rather than being concerned about how the society is rigged against working people, they're obviously concerned about how the sports rules are rigged against their favorite team, which has no obvious impact on their life. They are passionate about it.
Bread and circus.
Yeah, but they are passionate about it. I don't understand what their beef is with VAR. I guess they feel as if it leads to delays in the game and wrong calls, but
well, actually, Wilson, let's play a couple more seconds of that video because they actually explain it.
Critics of VAR, which the league adopted in 2023, say the system leads to referees taking too much time to make decisions, bringing games to long halts in the meantime. The game is expected to be rescheduled.
It sounds like these fans have an attention problem where they just can't sit still with their own thoughts for a few extra minutes while the referee is making the decision. So what I would say is a solution is the players on the field need to throw Ritalin and other ADD medications back into the crowd.
Yeah, I was going to say they should try some mindfulness exercise.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. So or throw mindfulness. Throw mindfulness tapes and audiobooks into the crowd as well. I'm not advocating drug distribution.
Right. Yeah. No. He retracts. Aaron retracts that.
Yeah. Mindfulness is a much safer approach.
Yeah. But I mean, it's, let him eat cake, let him eat fish cake. That worked well too. So, yeah. So what do we got for Isn't That Terrible, Aaron?
For Isn't That Terrible, the Russians are at it again. we have a new allegation of Russian interference. And I will say this, I've been very critical of Russiagate. I think it was a complete scam, the whole collusion, Trump-Russia thing. That was obviously a ridiculous conspiracy theory that was shown to be a hoax. Also, the Russian interference aspect of that also was, I think, a massive scam as well. But this time, actually, I do think they've caught the Russians doing something. And it's both terrible and funny. Here's the headline. U.S. government accused an unnamed Tennessee-based company of being funded by Russian operatives as part of an influence operation. The company is called Watch Tenet Now, or just Tenet, and it's linked to right-wing commentators such as Tim Pool, and Benny Johnson, also Dave Rubin. And look, if the allegations in the indictment are correct, it actually does look like Russia, the state broadcaster RT, did engage in a covert influence operation where basically they paid something like $10 million to this Tennessee company called Tenet, which is set up by a couple of right-wing pundits, and disguised themselves as being like Americans when really the money was coming from Russia. And they paid this company millions of dollars to produce content from people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and Benny Johnson. If the indictment is correct, I'm going to assume that it is. So it actually does look like Russia, for once, did engage in an influence operation. And of course, this has everybody who bought into Russiagate screaming vindication. The Russians are at it. A few problems, though. First of all, let's look at some of the content that this channel Tenet put out, featuring people like Dave Rubin. This is a few examples collected by Mike Tracy. FatCon Seattle, celebrate obesity with like-minded embodied people, Dave Rubin. So Dave Rubin's making fun of obese people.
Healthy at any size type of mentality.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one example. Is there anything you respect about Democrats with Dave Rubin? Okay. Education indoctrination. Former leftist condemns woke curriculum. And by the way, look at the view counts on these. Like, this is 8 months old, only 1,000 views. Like, for Dave Rubin, who's supposed to be a big influencer on the right, not much there.
Whoa.
Like 1,000 views. Anyway, so
that's kind of like encouraging. I'm actually very heartened by that, by his low view numbers. Good. Yeah.
So similar to previous, Russia-based influence operations or troll accounts, this doesn't seem to have been very successful. And again, the content really has nothing to do with the core Russiagate claims that this is all about helping Trump and sowing chaos. It just sounds like Russia, for some reason, decided to buy off some right-wing commentators and hope that would give them an audience that they could leverage for, but it just doesn't seem to be very successful. And again, $10 million.
I'd ask for my money back if I were Russia.
It's a lot of money they pay these people. Now, it's true that some of these people, like Tim Pool, has, from like a right-wing perspective, been skeptical of Ukraine funding, but it's like it's not coming from a very, like, there's not much of a critique there of the national security state and of using Ukraine for a disastrous proxy war and for undermining all the peace opportunities that existed. It's more just from like, why are we spending our money on this? America first. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I want to say that there are multiple levels of terrible in this. Isn't that terrible? Obviously, it's terrible what's happening, what the United States is doing, but it's a meta terrible, because I would say Tim Pool and Dave Rubin are also terrible.
Yeah, well, Dave Rubin, especially, I know as being just a unhinged anti-Palestinian bigot, and he's insulted me before on Twitter. He's insulted you, I think, too.
Yeah.
I mean, so no love here for Dave Rubin.
Right.
Tim
Pool, we're principled.
Tim Pool's show, remember when I got...
You did go on it.
Remember when I was, I had my train encounter with Chris Coons? Well, that was on my way to go do the Tim Pool show at his compound in suburban Maryland, I think. And I did that. And, we kind of agreed. I mean, basically, we agreed that Russiagate was a scam. But then the rest of the show was him, like, he was talking about how, like, homeless people basically unhoused people just want to be unhoused, and there's nothing we can do to help them. That was basically his argument. And I was like, all right. What's funny, it's like, first of all, what I find so funny here is like, okay, someone comes to you with an offer of like millions of dollars for you to produce a couple of videos a week, and you don't do any, obviously they didn't do any real scrutiny of who these people were trying to pay them, because that's a lot of money to produce just a couple of videos about, like, woke, like just woke bashing and all the typical right-wing stuff. So that's funny. And then it's also funny that, like, what, to the extent Russia was involved in this, and it does look like this comes from RT, Russia state television, like, what did Russia hope to gain out of this by spending so much money? And if you're a Russian, is this how you want your like tax money to be used, to like pay some like right-wing influencers a lot of money to like make videos about like making fun of like woke culture? It just seems like it's just funny. And like, did Russia also not, did the Russians involved this not think that they're going to not get caught? I mean, it's a really hard thing to pull off. And Russia's done this before. Like, they've tried to put out these media outlets, pretend as if they're independent. There's an outlet called Redfish a few years ago that was like on Twitter and social media. And Russia basically tried to conceal that RT was behind it. But of course, like you can't hide stuff like that. So was the aim, I don't know, did they really think they could get away with it? And also, it's like, you have to wonder, was the aim to like discredit these right-wing influencers? Because
wow,
it does make them look really stupid, you know? I don't know. It's hard to figure out.
This would be interesting if this were like a left-wing Russian plot.
All I do know is that because some Russians were caught doing this, those who pushed Russiagate for years, and again, Russiagate was not just this allegation that like Russia has like covert influence operations on social media. It was that Russia engaged in a sprawling conspiracy to elect Donald Trump the president and was directly conspiring with Trump and his campaign through blackmail and financial leverage and all these things. It was like the biggest conspiracy theory, the dumbest conspiracy theory, I think, ever in the US, and everybody bought into it. And now those who pushed that are claiming because of this one indictment, it's completely vindicated. So here, for example, is Joe Scarborough of Morning Joe.
To the same people that get out, a lot of them that get out and talk about the Russian hoax. Oh, it's a Russian. Oh, there's no, come on. What are you talking about? There's no connection between, this and Russia. And Russia's not trying to do, always apologizing for.
So notice how Joe there doesn't specify what position he's critiquing. He's making fun of people who, just to paraphrase him, he says, who say there's no connection between Trump and this. He doesn't say with any specificity what is the connection is. And because he knows actually the connection was between Trump and Russia, which was the core conspiracy theory he pushed and his network pushed for years and years and years. But now he's not saying between Russia and Trump because he knows that it actually is a moronic conspiracy theory.
Right.
He's pretending as if this indictment vindicates everything that he's now not trying to specify because he knows actually it's a scam.
Reminds me of when I was in high school and a history teacher encouraged me to not say just this. Like, I had to say this what? The evidence shows this. This what? What's the this? There's no this there. There's no there there. Joe Scarborough, there's no there, this, there.
Yeah. Your high school teacher was inadvertently ruining your chances of becoming an MSNBC host, because if you are an MSNBC now, you don't want to acknowledge that you pushed a conspiracy theory that Trump was controlled by Vladimir Putin for 6 years.
True.
Well, let's hear a little bit more.
Russia, always apologizing for Putin, always claiming that Vladimir Putin is not the bad guy, that Zelensky's actually the bad guy, like the historian who said, oh, Churchill's the bad guy in World War II, not Adolf Hitler. Like this has been going on for years. The kids call it gaslighting. And now we found out at least a few of these who are just straight on working for the Russian government, again, either knowingly or unknowingly.
Well, in fact, according to the indictment, it was unknowingly. The indictment does paint, Tim Pool and these guys as being unknowing of the fact that they were being duped by Russians. And again, while some of them do have overlapping views with Russia, the majority of the content here was about like just typical right-wing media stuff, like making fun of woke people. And again, even if every word in the allegation is true, I'm sorry, Joe, it doesn't validate your insane conspiracy theories for years and years and years that Russia was brainwashing millions of Americans to vote for Donald Trump and to be skeptical of fueling a proxy war in Ukraine. This is just one indictment that entails a few right-wing influencers and about $10 million, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what, for example, AIPAC spends every year to influence U.S. elections and actually sees results. Because it, rather than just like getting some right-wingers to produce some content, AIPAC is able to spend enough money to oust elected members of Congress. That's actual influence, and that's never something you'll hear complained about on MSNBC.
Right. We invite you to cover that, Joe. Please do. That would be great.
And those have been your 4 basic food groups.
Today's guest is Sarit Michaeli, who is the international advocacy lead for B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And I wanted to start off, before we get to the interview, I just wanted to show a tweet that was written by B'Tselem that I think speaks to the moment right now. Israel is killing the hostages in Gaza one by one. The 6 Israeli hostages whose bodies were recovered from Gaza this morning could have been saved if the Israeli government had heeded the pleas of their families and the Israeli public to reach a ceasefire and an exchange deal. The Israeli government places no value on human life, whether of its Gazan subjects or its own citizens. And here is Sarit Michaeli. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So you guys at B'Tselem have done such important work documenting human rights violations on the ground. There's so much to cover, unfortunately, because there are human rights violations all over Palestine right now. Wanted to start off, though, with asking you about what is happening right now in the West Bank.
Okay, in terms of the situation in the West Bank at the moment, it seems that Israel is pretty much transferring its different tactics and modus operandi from Gaza to the West Bank. We are in the midst now of the largest military operation that Israel has conducted in many years now in the northern West Bank, ostensibly to deal with terror. But what it is doing on the ground is destroying infrastructure. It's going into the Jenin, the Tulkarem refugee camps, and essentially, basically like pulling out the roads, just creating like utter disruption. Homes are being demolished. People have left. Israel is assessing that thousands of residents of the Jenin refugee camp have left their homes. There's a creation of this new wave of internal refugees within the West Bank. Needless to say, this also involves the killing of many Palestinians. Israel claims they are militants. Research that we need to do into this to assess and to look into the circumstances. It does appear that many of the people killed have been armed, and there were some people who were also killed within an exchange of gunfire. But there was also an 84-year-old person killed, a person with learning disabilities, and generally the destruction that has been happening and been inflicted by the Israeli security forces is something that people are describing as the Gazification of the West Bank. This is what the Israeli army is doing. But then the other branch of the Israeli government, Israeli settlers, are using their own form of intense violence to hound Palestinian herding communities out of their homes. And this morning we heard that another small community in the northern Jordan Valley has succumbed to this type of settler harassment and violence and threats and decided to leave their homes because for the past weeks they've been dealing with this intense harassment with no protection from the Israeli authorities. And this, maybe I should just say, this community in the northern Jordan Valley is adding to about 19 entire Palestinian herder communities that have been forcibly transferred from their homes since the war began, since October 7th.
Well, you at B'Tselem put out a video that's extremely disturbing. Rape in the Name of God is the title of it. And this shows a group of settlers harassing Palestinians in the South Hebron Hills. And as we're going to hear, one of the settlers mentions Sde Teiman, the Sde Teiman Center, which is, of course, where Palestinian prisoners were tortured and raped by Israeli guards. So let's take a look at this video.
Next time someone touches him, my cows.
Why your cows came here?
Why, guys? Because this is my land.
But this is my house.
I was given it by God and Abraham and Isaac, Yaakov.
Shame. Hey,
Shut the fuck up.
This is my house.
Not your house.
This is okay. That's your house. Okay, you
Tell your crazy witch to go to fuck to the house. Let's go.
Where?
Let's go right now. Show
What
me
you
phone.
what you want?
Well, I want to dance with you, man.
Dance with
I
me?
want to dance with you. You look,
I'm not your bitch.
you look sweet. You are my bitch. And you look sweet, you know? You look so fresh, so sweet. I will be happy to sit with you in a jail someday. I will be happy. You know Sde Teiman? Sde Teiman? אונס לשם שמיים, מה שנאמר. אתה מבין? מה אני מדבר?
I mean, the fact that this was recorded.
Yeah, there's a few things about this. The first is just the utter sense of impunity that these Israeli settlers clearly have, and for a good reason, because they do actually, it's not just a sense of impunity. They have impunity. Nothing is going to be done to them under the current government, the current regime. Not that much was done in previous governments, but under the Ben Gvir police takeover, the Israeli police have clarified they're simply not going to do anything to stop settlers from this harassment, this intimidation. So that's the first thing I think you can see in this video. The second thing I think that is probably a bit more complicated to understand, unless you've been on the ground, is that there is this big mixture between just very aggressive, I would say, according to my personal assessment, sadistic kind of activities, actions, urges, hateful urges. It's all mixed up with this whole Jewish supremacy kind of guided and very religious and very messianic perspective. And I'm not saying that this is in any way belittling the political, the systematic, and the very much the government sponsored aspects of settler violence. But there's also this additional, just terrible, violent and very pleased and joyful sort of violence that is now happening, and that is really just blighting the lives of these Palestinian communities. This is one example that is especially egregious because of all of these, also this horrific sexual harassment and these very sexually aggressive and violent undertones. But these are things that we're hearing again and again from settlers on the ground. The objectives in the West Bank are taking over as much land as possible, pushing Palestinians away from the rural areas in order that they can then be taken over and exploited by Israeli settlements, by Israel. That's been the objective for decades. But the horrors of October 7th, and also the lack of any sort of focus on the West Bank, the lack of interest of most Israelis, and also probably of the international community, the lack of bandwidth, I also think, are enabling Israel and the settlers working hand in glove to really further this objective and to push forward irreversible changes that are harming both Palestinians as a collective, but also these individual Palestinian communities.
We also have video of Netanyahu, who appeared on television and showed a map. And this map totally erases the West Bank. Let's take a look at this image. He's not even hiding this literal ethnic cleansing. Can you comment on the significance of his showing this on television?
I have to say that on Israeli television, if you look at mainstream Israeli images, you wouldn't be particularly surprised by this image. You know, it's been in the recent prominence that the phrase "from the river to the sea" has gotten, supposedly as expressing anti-Semitism and expressing a kind of desire to wipe out Israel and the danger, the alleged danger of this desire. But whereas in actual fact, what is happening now between the river to the sea is full Israeli control over all of the land, with Israel having created these very distinct kind of like areas based on the different criteria, and certainly has created distinct also categories of Palestinians, all of them inferior to myself as an Israeli Jew in terms of the access to rights. But each Palestinian also has this distinct area. But Israel and the Israeli regime controls the entire area. So in a way, from the river to the sea is the reality that we're existing under right now, except that it's a reality of apartheid. It's a reality of Jewish supremacy. Israeli mainstream discourses, and this can be viewed again and again in many different, maps. There was just this week a new map issued by the Israeli Ministry of Education that did something very similar also. There's like a tiny erasure. There's a certain very, very small, unclear dotted line that connotes the West Bank, but primarily you see Palestinian enclaves in a sea of Israeli territory, right? And that's also the way Israel's current Israeli government's perception of the future and any sort of possibility of any sort of sovereignty between the river and the sea is phrased, is actually put in writing in the founding document of the current Israeli government, right? There is no room for any sovereignty other than Jewish sovereignty between the river and the sea. I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting exactly. This is how Israelis are brought up to think. And then when most Israelis don't really think of the West Bank as occupied, don't really view the occupied territories as being occupied, it's for a good reason, because there is a vast governmental investment in denying this sort of information from Israelis, for example, in the education system. That's not to say that the information is not available, but the wiping out, the blurring of the green line is a very long term policy of the Israeli government. It's expressed in a lot of our kind of daily conversations here in Israel. So I'm not surprised that Netanyahu has erased the West Bank. From the perspective of Netanyahu, the West Bank is under full Israeli control, except that there's kind of like this counter argument, which is that actually the Palestinian Authority have some form of self-rule in these tiny enclaves. And that is essentially another one of the Israeli kind of like arguments that are used to justify our full control over everywhere. But because the mere existence of the Palestinian Authority is utilized as a kind of a counter argument to demonstrate essentially that Palestinians are not occupied, right? That they're actually living in some sort of independence, which is of course an absolute lie.
Yeah, I mean, the Palestinian Authority has accomplished what? There are some VIPs that get special treatment. They don't have to go through checkpoints like in the Palestinian Authority. And they do employ a lot of people. So there are a lot of people in the West Bank who rely on the PA for their jobs. But aside from that, in terms of protecting anybody, for example, from the latest Israeli assaults on places like Jenin, Palestinian Authority is nowhere to be found. And there's a lot of frustration against them in the West Bank because of it. What do you think Israel's goal is in the West Bank? Is it similar to Gaza, to push out as many people as possible? Like, are they expecting, or are they trying to encourage another exodus of Palestinians?
I don't know that there's one concrete, coherent goal. I think there are many goals. And if you speak to people like Smotrich, who very maybe usefully for us wrote down the exact objective that he has in his plan, which is to remove all Palestinians from anywhere between the river and the sea. But if you're talking to more mainstream people in the Israeli settler movement or the Israeli right, when you think about their plans, it's not 100% coherent. And I often think that plans are often, and this is my analysis, of course, the plans are based on what is realistically achievable at any given moment. 2 years ago, if you'd have spoken to settler leaders, they would not dream in their wildest dreams that they'd be able to forcibly remove so many Palestinian herding communities from their land so quickly and easily. I think before 2016, you would have probably not been able, the assessment of what is, before Trump's election, the assessment of what is realistic was probably different. So, and when you listen, for example, to Orit Struk recently, I'm not sure you followed her statement about feeling like she lives in a miraculous time, right? She's a government minister, the minister of essentially settlement. It's very clear that she did not expect this quote unquote miracle to happen very soon. This, by the way, is a miracle when, tens of thousands of Israeli citizens, I'm not even talking about Gazans, have been evacuated from their homes, when thousands of Israelis have been injured and 1,200 Israelis killed on October 7th. That is a miraculous period for the Israeli messianic far right, because it enables all of this settlement expansion. It enables so many things in the West Bank. I mean, I'll give you one example. Last year, the olive harvest fell, or the annual olive harvest starts at about 15th of October. So really days after October 7th and the beginning of the war, there was also the beginning of the olive harvest. And almost all Palestinians in the West Bank were not able to harvest some of their crops. The assessment is that 50% of the crops were not harvested last year. And that was because of, due to the very concerted and coordinated campaign by settlers and the army to stop people from reaching their olive groves in order to harvest. This is something, this is them utilizing an opportunity to a devastating effect. I don't see, by the way, how we're arriving at any sort of new dynamic this year. And remember, in just over a month, people are going to try and reach and access their olive trees again throughout the West Bank, with the same issues still plaguing them. Settlers organized in these paramilitary groups with the blessing of the Israeli army, many of them carrying weapons provided by the army, many of them part of these rapid response units. A lot of Israelis have also received guns and weapons from Ben Gvir. So all of these things still happening on the ground. And I would say that they will go as far as they can. Many of them are fantasizing openly, none of this is secret, about removing all of the Palestinians over the river to Jordan. But I'm not saying that this is on the cards. What I am saying is that the current reality that we're dealing with in the West Bank is getting closer and closer, is looking closer and closer, what we've been seeing in Gaza. And if you had told me a year ago that Israel would be able to empty the northern Gaza Strip from almost all of its inhabitants, to demolish almost all of the infrastructure in that area, we probably wouldn't have believed it ourselves. So we need to be very cautious, and we have to also accept that the international community has been absolutely, has simply not stepped up to their role in thwarting these kinds of Israeli actions.
And I'm going to ask you more about the international community in a second, but returning to the issue of sexual violence and rape, I want to ask you about the report that B'Tselem put out last month, Welcome to Hell. And could you explain why it's called Welcome to Hell, and also summarize the findings of the report?
Yeah, it's called Welcome to Hell because this is what a jailer, an Israeli prison service worker, told one of our witnesses when they entered the jail, the prison. The report essentially looks at the testimonies of Palestinian prisoners who have been either detained after October 7th or detained before, but experienced the kinds of conditions post-October 7th in the Israeli prison system. We're not talking about Sde Teiman, right? In a way, paradoxically, we only spoke to people who Israel did not think of as very dangerous terrorists, quote unquote, because they were all released. We interviewed them after they were released, most without actually facing any sort of trial. Maybe they might have been administrative detainees, they might have been arrested, kept for days or weeks and then released. And some of them are actually people who served their sentences. But the majority were not tried, didn't face any proper real trial. And they gave the most gruesome accounts that are very consistent, even though they came from different prisons and different towns, and none of them have been in touch with one another in any systematic way. They gave accounts that demonstrate the systemic nature of what has been happening in the Israeli prison system. And the way we summed it up is that after October 7th, Israel turned the prison system in it that deals with Palestinians into a network of torture camps, because the treatment that these Palestinians have faced in that period amounts to torture in many of the cases, in some cases amounts to abuse, and it includes the whole range of these abusive practices like overt violence, intense violence, beatings, and also humiliations and terrible conditions, horrific, both kind of living conditions and also any sort of ability to maintain a sort of daily routine or any sort of hygiene has been destroyed. Starvation as a policy, literally, people are losing, 10 and 20 kilo of their weight when they're released because they're not able to eat enough, and also just a denial of medical treatment, a denial of sleep, all of these horrific conditions. And the most important thing I would say is that none of this is the result of individual actions by any sort of individual prison guard. These are systemic actions inspired by Minister Ben-Gvir again.
Right, so this is not a couple of bad apples or rogue agents. This is systemic.
Absolutely. The sheer fact that so much of this has been described by so many Palestinians that have been released from prison, who, as I said, were in different detention centers in different periods and in different areas, and come and live in different areas, but described such similar policies, is really crucial. The other really horrific thing is that Israel actually, I wouldn't say admits to some of it, but boasts that some of this is correct. Now, I want to be clear. Israel hasn't said, oh, we're starving prisoners, oh, we're beating them up, or anything of that sort. But Minister Ben-Gvir has essentially boasted change or the deterioration in the prison conditions as an achievement, right? So obviously they're very careful about saying that everything is done within the framework of the law. We would disagree. We would say it's absolutely illegal and a violation of international law. But many of these things, like the cancelling of any possibility of Palestinians to hold any sort of personal items or buy additional food even from the prison canteen, all of these things have been stated openly by Israel, by official Israeli spokespeople.
And we know that the Sde Teiman violence and rape has been actually deemed as legitimate by a member of the Knesset who said out loud in front of the entire Knesset that it was legitimate to insert sticks into someone's rectum.
I mean, look, it's really one of the most depressing and just hopeless periods in any sort of living memory, and I've lived there, all my life, or barring certain periods. I don't remember a worse period in Israel. So many horrific things and so many red lines, or things that we would have been up in arms about even a year ago, as I said, are just, people are just becoming so normalized. One of them is that just the callous approach to such horrors, and all of this justified by the horrors perpetrated by Hamas. Instead of saying these are absolute horrors, these are crimes that no one should be perpetrating, many Israelis are saying, oh, well, we'll do the same. It's justified because what was done to us. we cannot accept this. B'Tselem has been really just on the front lines, I think, of demanding, an end to this just moral abyss, but certainly we're a tiny minority right now in Israeli society. Things are changing a little bit, I think. I think some people are beginning to wake up from this really, horrific, I think, just this orgy of hate and revenge that Israeli society was plunged into. But not all. You still hear the same sort of rhetoric that, it's unconscionable, and Israelis would immediately complain about it if it came from any other source in the world. It would be absolutely, denounced as the worst kinds of anti-Semitism. But it's deemed reasonable when it comes to Palestinians here.
The International Court of Justice recently handed down an advisory opinion on Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And it was pretty unequivocal. It said, the state of Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful. Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. Your thoughts on the significance of this ruling, and as a human rights group working in Israel, can you do something with this? Does this, bolster the case against Israel at all in any kind of legal forum, or is this just yet another ruling that the world will basically ignore?
Well, I think both could be correct. The case against Israeli, I would say against the Israeli government, against the Israeli regime, or the Israeli human rights violations is absolutely bolstered by this. It's also, we have to be mindful that it's, even though it's the foremost legal instance on these issues in the world and should be viewed as a binding decision. It's not. It's an advisory opinion, and it's already been clarified to us by many governments that this is an advisory opinion. However, I do think there's two things from our, there's many things, obviously, but there's two things to mention right now. The first is that there are many international fora, and there are also many governments who do respect the ICJ as a really important part of the rules-based world order. I know it sounds like a cliche these days, but it's still something that we should continue to enhance and bolster, because it's in many ways it's the only protection that people have against tyranny, and especially against international human rights violations, like in a war, in an armed conflict. So there are different places where this will matter, and where governments can be confronted, and also different institutions like the United Nations institutions, and there should be an ongoing challenge to the status quo in these institutions. And the advisory opinion is very important on that level, because it ends a certain legal debate that has not really been a real legal debate. The illegality of the settlement was known to Israel since a few months after the beginning of the occupation, because there is an advisory opinion, or there's actually more like a legal opinion by Theodore Meron, who was then the legal advisor of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All of this is well known and established facts, saying that that settling in the occupied territories would violate Article 49 of the Geneva Convention. So Israel knew it in real time. It chose, and it still chooses, to violate the law. But it is important to have this final stamp on the illegality of the settlement and the occupation regime, and also on apartheid in the West Bank in some parts of the ruling. But there's also another issue, which is, I think, the moral issue and also the political issue, which is that up until now there's been a very useful excuse for the international community to avoid action, and that excuse was grounded in a sort of, there's these ongoing legal debates about this issue, and we need to reach some sort of agreed decision. Well, here's your agreed decision. There is no room any longer for, kind of like foot dragging on this issue. Another question, or another kind of like counter argument that I've heard personally, and a lot of my colleagues, and I'm sure you've heard it as well over many years, is that, the issues should be resolved within a framework of a diplomatic process or in a peace deal. And I think it's become clear now that this advisory opinion at least puts an end to the notion that there is somehow, it's okay to continue this illegal, this very, very violent, cruel occupation, while at the same time talking and paying lip service, I would say, to some future diplomatic agreement that would lead to the establishment of a two-state solution and end the problems. That is just like, that argument can no longer, in my reading, right, in our position at B'Tselem, can no longer be used to stall effective action that will get Israel to comply with this advisory opinion. And of course, it's not an easy thing to do. Look at what's going on in Gaza. Israel has not complied with requests by the international community and not even with requests by the United States of America, our biggest funder and enabler. So, I'm not saying it's not describing this as anything that could be easy, but it just really reiterates the need to have real action that will actually get Israeli policymakers to change course, be it criminal accountability, like, for example, the ICC's or the ICC chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants, but also diplomatic accountability, economic accountability. A whole range of different tools are now available to the international community, and they need to use them to get Israeli policymakers to change.
Yeah, it's interesting when you brought up the international community. One of the things that I wanted to point out is the way that the United States has obviously enabled Israel. And I'm going to quote one of the Palestinians who you guys interviewed for your Welcome to Hell report. They put cigarettes out in my mouth and on my body. They put clamps on my testicles that were attached to something heavy. It went on like that for a whole day. My testicles swelled up and my left ear bled. Then a journalist asked Matthew Miller of the State Department about the rapes and sexual violence committed against Palestinians. And his response was basically, Israel should investigate itself.
Going back to Israel, Israeli media today released a video showing Israeli soldiers raping a Palestinian detainee at Sde Teiman detention camp. The footage was very disturbing. I know you have commented on the reports about this detention center before, but we now have a new evidence, which is video. Have you seen that video, and do you have anything to say on that, and also the reports of rape in Israeli prisons?
So we have seen the video, and reports of sexual abuse of detainees are horrific. They ought to be investigated fully by the government of Israel, by the IDF.
And B'Tselem actually responded to that, because I think it has become abundantly clear over the years, with every year again and again, and now I don't know whether we even need to explain it any longer, that Israel is not going to investigate itself. It's unwilling and unable, in the words of the Rome Statute. It's unwilling because there is simply no capacity, both in terms of the actual investigations, it's just not possible, but also in this current political climate. Can you even imagine Israeli investigators really holding accountable Israeli officials for anything? I mean, it's absurd. And I have to say that we need not just the United States, although the United States is the most important player in this, but we need other international actors, the European Union, its member states, like-minded countries in the West, to begin to acknowledge that the Israeli system isn't going to provide accountability, and that it's just this knee-jerk reaction of just saying, well, we need an investigation. But B'Tselem's demonstrated again and again that these investigations are nothing but a very elaborate whitewash. I think we made that case very well, and it led us, at least in 2016, to stop referring cases to the investigative bodies, because we reached the conclusion that, as I said, that they function as a whitewash mechanism, not as a real mechanism to hold Israeli officials accountable. But I think now, when we have a government that is led by people who are openly, inciting to racism and inciting to violence, and also openly saying that they're never going to arrest or hold any Israeli soldier or border police officer or police officer accountable, then I think the case is clear. And then you have just so much of this foot dragging and additional red tape that is being pushed forward, for example, by the different kind of briefs that have been provided to the ICC by different countries, including the United States, that isn't even part of the ICC, just in order to either get Israel off the hook or buy time until the decision of the pre-trial chamber about these arrest warrants. And this is unacceptable. There needs to be an understanding that you cannot have a system like the ICC, for example, which is only being applied to, to African dictators. It's just not acceptable. And I think when I say that our kind of outreach on this issue is primarily to the West, that's because countries in the global South are actually angry and furious about this reality, where Israeli policymakers are receiving, a totally different, set of conditions, or when it comes to the holding of this country, of Israel, accountable in the ICC. I think the credibility of the court and of all of the countries that are part of it is really at stake here. It's not just about Israeli policymakers, Gallant and Netanyahu.
You responded to a tweet by Kamala Harris the other day. I'm going to show the Kamala Harris tweet and then your response to that. Today, POTUS and I met with the U.S. hostage deal negotiation team. The murder of Hersh Goldberg Poland and 5 other hostages was a brutal, barbaric act by Hamas terrorists. As POTUS said, Hamas leaders will pay for these crimes. It's long past time for a ceasefire and hostage deal. We need to bring the hostages home and end the suffering in Gaza. And you responded, Netanyahu is working for a Trump victory and will not willingly give Biden-Harris the win of a ceasefire and hostage deal. The only way to achieve this objective is through enough U.S. pressure to force Netanyahu's hand. So can you elaborate on this tweet and what you're saying there?
Yes. At the risk of sounding a bit like Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, I think it's become abundantly clear, and to Israelis, and I have to say, I spend almost every evening, and I have done for the past probably 7 months, protesting together with the hostage families in Tel Aviv on nights that I'm not in the West Bank. I feel like it's such a profound moral duty as Israelis now to stand by these families and to demand 2 things, the 2 basic things that they're demanding. One is a hostage deal, the other is a ceasefire. Those are 2 like interlinked issues. And the reason I'm standing by these families is both the moral commitment to the hostages and also the moral commitment to try and stop the killing of Gazans and to try and also thwart the killing of Israelis, Lebanese, of whoever. All human beings will be killed if this further escalates. So I have to say that on a personal level, I've become very familiar with a lot of the people who are struggling to bring back their relatives, their loved ones, and who lost so much in the last few weeks. And those people have reached the conclusion, and I agree with them, that the reason that we're not in the midst of a hostage swap that will bring back their loved ones is because of Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's not because of Hamas, although that's not to say that I think that Hamas has acted in any way reasonably on this issue. Of course not. B'Tselem has clarified our condemnation of holding hostages and of all of the atrocities perpetrated by Hamas. But that is the reality. The reality is they're not coming back alive, the ones who are still living, unfortunately, without a hostage deal. And everyone understands the conditions of a hostage deal. And the fact that Israel is still finding ways to constantly undermine this is the result of Netanyahu's decision to value the continuation of his coalition, to value the continuation of the occupation and of the possible one day resettlement of Gaza, although that is a possibility that hasn't happened yet, over the lives of the hostages. And I think this is combined completely with what is clear to me as an Israeli following US politics, that is absolutely clear to me that Netanyahu is has bet on a Trump victory. I mean, before President Biden left the race, I think it was very clear that not only was Netanyahu betting on a Trump victory, he was also acting as if Biden is already a lame duck president based on the reality on the ground. That is how many Israelis in power were acting. Since the change ticket, I think Netanyahu, and this is not B'Tselem's analysis. B'Tselem doesn't analyze US or Israeli politics. This is my personal analysis as an Israeli who is very interested in this issue. I think it affects us immensely. I'm absolutely sure that Netanyahu is trying to work to secure a Trump victory. And this is it's obvious that, and it should have been obvious to people inviting him to Congress, that he wouldn't give the Democratic Party any sort of win if it depends on anything he can do. To me, this is blatantly obvious. I think anyone who has followed Netanyahu, I'm sure the US administration understands this. And it is baffling to me how the administration continues to act as if the relationship with Netanyahu is an ordinary diplomatic relationship and not a very blatant and clear situation where Israel's prime minister is undermining any sort of effort at, if this effort is existing. And I think the US does want to bring back the hostages, at least the American citizens. It's very clear that Netanyahu will not allow this, because this will also be a Biden-Harris victory. And this also is very worrying, because if we have to wait now until November for any sort of progress on this, I don't think the Israeli hostages will make it, or at least many of them will not make it. And I shudder to think of the countless Palestinians who are going to be killed in Israeli bombings in Gaza during this period. We just don't know their names yet. We don't know about them yet, who they are, but we know they will be killed because this is not ending. This war that we were told will end by Christmas, by January, is not ending, and it's almost a year now.
Why is it that Netanyahu prefers Trump?
I know it might not be this clear from the perspective of the US progressive direction, but I think it's absolutely clear that Netanyahu can get much more, that the Israeli, settlement, apartheid, occupation project can receive more from Trump than it can from a Democratic president. It's blatantly obvious. And again, I think that many US progressives who think that Biden, and I share this position, I wasn't that disappointed with the Biden administration's position on Palestine, because I didn't have high expectations, but I did have certain requests, demands, and those, and I think Palestinians did, and not many of them have been met. But I think when we compare the ability to thwart some of the worst excesses of the colonization of the West Bank under Biden and under Trump, I think those are just, I worked under the two administrations, and it's much harder, basically. And I think this is the reason why the Israeli right, Netanyahu, the settlement lobby, are very much committed to Trump victory. Remember also, Trump isn't just about Trump, it's about evangelical Christians who are absolutely deeply invested in Armageddon, and us all having to go through Armageddon, Israelis and Palestinians, in order to fulfill their theological fantasies. And this means, again, like boosting settlements even more than they are today, supporting all of the most reactionary like perspectives in Israeli society. So it's very clear, it goes in one package. I think this would be my assessment of what happened during the Trump administration's, kind of like free for all for Israel. That was basically what it was. And another Trump term, I think is viewed by the Israeli right as, if we're living in a miraculous time now, according to Orit Struk, then who can even, begin to understand what kind of miracles will happen if Trump comes in or gets in again and is voted again in November. That's my assessment.
And what could and should Biden do if he actually did care about, I don't really think he cares about Palestinians, but if he actually did care about getting the hostages home, what would he be doing?
Look, I think there's no other option, or nothing is going to change Netanyahu's mind other than pressure. I think we have to be clear about that. And I would say, of course, I'm not naive. I'm fully aware of the political reality in the United States. I'm aware of the coming elections, the impact of AIPAC and the Israeli lobby in the United States and Congress. And so obviously, I'm not saying that I think any of this is necessarily realistic. I'm just saying without this, nothing is going to happen. There needs to be I would say two broad actions by President Biden. The first is to hold Netanyahu accountable personally, to instead of making these very measured statements about him thinking that Netanyahu is not doing enough. I would say the more accurate description of reality is that the Netanyahu is doing a lot to thwart a prisoner exchange, a hostage swap. The second thing that President Biden and Biden administration should do is use all the different diplomatic leverage points that they have over Israel in order to, again, to drive the message to Israeli policymakers that the United States will not be taken for a fool on this issue. And again, that's taking or going, based on the assumption that the United States is interested in releasing, at the very least, the American hostages.
In terms of the settlements, I'm curious your thoughts on what the long-term solution is. Obviously, there are people like myself who just believe that the ideal is a single democratic state, but that might never happen. And so if we're going to have to live in this two-state framework, the settlements, as everyone recognizes, are just a huge obstacle. Now, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert recently put out a proposal with a Palestinian counterpart, basically calling for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And it proposes basically Israel keeping major West Bank settlement blocks. But for the first time, I believe, it endorses this idea of giving Palestinians equal land of equal size and value inside Israel. So basically, if Israel is going to steal the West Bank settlement blocks, then they have to give Palestinians an equal amount of land inside of Israel, which to my knowledge, Israel's never done before. Previously, when Israel proposed such a thing of keeping the West Bank settlement blocks, it offered Palestinians a land swap of like 9-1 or something like that, where basically Israel keeps 9 times the size of land that it steals from Palestinians. That was the basis of the so-called generous offer at Camp David in July 2000. So, do you think that's a feasible solution, is doing a land swap where Israel does get to keep these illegal settlement blocks? Or, we just had the ICJ ruling saying that Israel should evacuate all of its settlers from the West Bank because it doesn't have the right to a single inch of territory there. And I'm just curious, let's say in a perfect world, U.S. withdrew its military support for Israel, and the Israeli military could no longer sustain guarding the settlements, and the Israeli military withdrew from the West Bank. what do you think would happen to the settlers? Would they leave because they no longer had the protection of the military, or would they like fight till the end to keep what they believe is their God endowed land?
So first of all, I have to say that I personally and B'Tselem we're not experts on any of this in terms of like the mechanisms of negotiations and different proposals. And B'Tselem doesn't take a position actually on any sort of what should be the correct and the right future outcome for resolving the current reality, which I said, and I'll say it again, is a one-state reality. So B'Tselem doesn't really propose any blueprint on how to end the conflict. Again, I don't really even like to use the term conflict because it implies some sort of equal parties. But the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians should be resolved by Israelis and Palestinians. We will look at any sort of proposed solution or outcome through the benchmark of human rights and whether it adheres to and maintains human rights. Having said that, I think if you're thinking about any sort of future move towards a two-state solution, which is what the international community all wants, Israel has, by the way, completely denounced the possibility of a two-state solution, right? There's a recent Knesset vote on that. I think there's the first is we need to also be aware of the fact that the issue isn't really about the technical way to divide up the land. The issue is the political will. And if you're asking me if under some future possibility, Israel will no longer provide security for settlements, like when I think about this issue, I'm thinking first of all about a very, very staggered and an incremental process. Any sort of territorial compromise, as we used to call it in the 80s, would be a slow process. I'm not saying 20 years slow, or the way Israel when Israel said, looked at or designed the Oslo process as a staggered and kind of like delayed process. That was a very useful tactic to basically make sure that we're in this constant, always in a diplomatic process. We just never reach the end of the process. But what I'm saying is that it's there are about 600,000 Israelis, even more, living over the Greenland outside of Jerusalem. There's about another 240,000 Israelis living in East Jerusalem, in the occupied part of East Jerusalem. The thought that any of these changes can be done overnight, I think, is not realistic. The other issue is, I think, that if you're looking at the current makeup of Israeli society, I don't think it's also realistic to expect Israel to move actively to resolve any sort of these parts or these issues with settler takeovers of West Bank land of its own accord. If you're thinking about the current Israeli army, a very large minority and possibly even now a majority of soldiers, especially in the rank and file on the ground in the West Bank, are themselves settlers. They're part of the settler movement, or they support the settlement enterprise. Mid-range officers now are largely also overrepresenting religious Zionism, right? The religious Zionist movement, and more very high-ranking officers are part of this movement. So thinking about, I think we have to also be realistic about how the Israeli public thinks and acts now, and there would be a need for very intense, I think, external intervention in order to change these. I don't really see Israel pulling itself out through, with its bootstraps, as it were, in order to resolve anything in the West Bank. There is one, I would say, exception to this, which is, I think that the current reality of settlement in the West Bank, or the latest invention in the settlement enterprise, is is I think something that can actually be removed almost overnight. And these are the herding farms. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept, but over the past 10 years or so, the Israeli settler movement, together with the Israeli government, has established literally dozens of very small farming outposts. Those could be in the form of small agricultural farms like plantations, or grazing farms, like farms that would have sheep or cows. And those are the most effective way that the Israeli settler movement has found in the past decade to take over vast areas of the West Bank. Because what they do is they bring their own sheep and graze them in places that Palestinians used to graze sheep. And the kind of business model of these herding outposts is violence. They use intense violence to get these herding communities to leave the areas they've been grazing on for years, for decades. And now we're in a place where almost all of the open land in the West Bank has already been covered with these herding outposts. But I think that and this is, by the way, the admission of Ze'ev Hever Zambish, who's one of the architects of the settlement movement. He's the head of the Amanah company that has been slapped with sanctions by the Canadian government, not the United States, but hopefully the United States will be influenced by this Canadian decision. But in any case, Zambish himself is quoted as having said that the use of herding farms or agricultural farms for land takeover is a very useful tool, because with just a few cows and sheep, you can take over massive amounts of space that would be much harder to take over using actual construction. Construction is slow, it takes a long time. Whereas just taking a few youths, putting a few cows in a farm and then terrorizing the Palestinians to go away, to leave these areas, is very effective. We see it on the ground all the time. But the flip side of this is that these herding farms can be removed literally overnight. So it would be very hard to uproot settlements that were established, that have people living in them. But I think that currently the dozens of herding outposts around the West Bank that have been established with Israeli support, with Israeli funding, they can actually be removed very quickly. That would free up a vast amount of land for Palestinian use, helping the Palestinian economy. So I think this would be something that I think is realistic. I'm not saying it's realistic that it can happen under the current political climate. I'm just saying that it's technically very easy, because the only thing you'll need to do is remove the people who are farming there and the livestock. There isn't really a lot of infrastructure yet. They're building this infrastructure. So from my perspective, a good way to start, if you're thinking about territorial compromise, and again, as I should say, B'Tselem doesn't work on this issue, but a good way to start is to think about the open land in the West Bank. It's primarily Area C, right? It's land that was designated as Area C. That is an achievable objective, and it's also a confidence building measure. Removing these violent settlers from the land will help Palestinians, will protect them from the daily attacks they're experiencing, and would actually be technically not that difficult to do, provided obviously there's the political will to do it.
Sarit, I wanted to ask you to comment on a pretty viral clip that comes from an Israeli podcast called Two Nice Jewish Boys.
If you're listening to our words and saying, how could they be advocating to, do massive bombing, indiscriminate bombing, how could they talk about killing children? We're not advocating to target children, but forgive us if we don't give a shit if, everybody there dies. It's just the way we feel. It's just the way Israelis feel.
Yeah.
Because, and this is what that's what the Hulon attack did. I wrote to Sharon, my wife, I was like, it'll be you or me tomorrow, or Daniela or Itai, God forbid.
Yep.
And so I would, if you gave me a button to just erase Gaza, every single living being in Gaza would no longer be living tomorrow, I would press it in a second. That's just, I think most Israelis
if
probably
that's
agree.
The choice, yeah.
Do most
Wow,
Israelis agree?
you're really pulling out all the really upsetting and depressing manifestations of what it means to be an Israeli these days. Look, I have to say a few things. First of all, I think it might be true that maybe not all Israelis, but a lot of Israelis feel this way. Not everyone. I'm surrounded by people who are utterly shocked daily by what we're doing in Gaza, and that does not remove one iota of the sorrow and the shock and the deep sense of mourning we're feeling about losing, in some cases, relatives, friends, and so much on October 7th. If in any way, the way I see it, I think empathy and mourning is actually expands. You don't run out of it. You feel, in fact,
A
more.
zero-sum game.
Absolutely. That's at least my personal experience over the past year and even long before. But yeah, we have to admit that these kinds of statements we've heard again and again on Israeli TV from day one. I don't know what even to say beyond the fact that it baffles me how one can think that we should be treated as individuals, not kind of like as a group of occupiers who should all be killed, and not think that we should treat people on the other side in the same way. I just cannot understand how people don't get it, but clearly I'm in the minority. More people feel the opposite. A lot of people were really just sucked into this, what I've described as like this orgy of revenge. It's not just about revenge. I should also clarify, because there is this, but there's also a political project that is being used. I mean, Israel is cynically manipulating the horror, the suffering, the trauma in order to then facilitate a lot of political changes. But there are also Israelis who are just genuinely don't understand where this is coming from. I think a lot of Israelis also don't really understand the context. And again, like in Israel, also any sort of discussion of the context is immediately framed as justifying the horrors, which of course is just absolutely should be denounced. The two things are not the same. On the contrary, I think in order to prevent some sort of future repetition of this, we have to understand the roots, the policy roots of what happened on October 7th. I think it's also the responsibility of the media and of politicians and of leaders to demarcate what is acceptable, what is an acceptable way to show our anger, and what is an unacceptable way to show our anger. And it just wasn't that way. Since October 7th, I think if you're only exposed to Israeli media, virtually the only messages you'll hear again and again are these messages, right? There are no civilians in Gaza. They're all responsible. They voted for Hamas, in 2006, so they have to pay the price right now for what Hamas has done. I mean, all of those things, you've heard them, I'm sure, many, many times. They would do the same to us. This is what they've done to us. There's no other way to respond other than how we're responding. Like, I totally reject these things. I also have to say, when you fantasize about a land that is literally half an hour's drive from where you live, but it could be on the other side of the planet because you don't know anyone who lives there and you've never been in touch with them, and they've been so dehumanized in your mind, then it might be easy to fantasize about erasing them overnight. I know Gazans. I work with Gazans. I meet with people who I can't go into Gaza. None of the B'Tselem staffers are ever able to meet anywhere other than outside of this region. But I can't imagine erasing so many people who I know. I mean, not that I would ever, God forbid, imagine erasing people. But do you see what I mean? It's like when you've experienced such an erasure of the humanity of the people on the other side of the border, and the 2.5 million people, right? It's let's just be mindful of this. Then I think it's much easier to just say these things. I also want to say one other thing, which is that the fantasy of Gaza disappearing is not really a new thing in our society. The fantasy of like Gazans suddenly becoming the problem of someone else, the international community having to deal with them, or Egypt, Rabin himself, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in the past, there's this famous quote of him saying like, wishing that Gaza would just drown in the sea. So like this notion that the people of Gaza, so many of them who are refugees, who have lost their land inside Israel, and are living in utter, in an open air prison camp for almost 20 years now, could and should disappear, is not just about the last year. There are so many, difficult things that we will have to face as a society, as an Israeli society, if we're ever going to build a future where there is any value to human life, even to Israeli life, and the conversation about what we have done in Gaza will have to be part of it. I'm not saying that I think this is a realistic prospect. I don't see it happening. Most people are still in the same place, or in a very close place to where they were a year ago. But I also think that bringing back the hostages has to be the first step in any sort of process that will lead Israelis to understand the sheer magnitude, the horrors of what we have inflicted on Gazans, and which is, none of it is ending, right? It hasn't stopped.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really enlightening. And thank you also to you and B'Tselem for all the great work that you're doing.
Thank you, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, another depressing interview about the world's worst crisis. It's very grim, but, in any sad situation, you have to look for rays of light, and certainly activists like Sarit doing the work on the ground to expose the Israel occupation. It's a very positive thing. And, I may have some points of disagreement about the nature of Israel and whether, what can you do with a state like this, which is just so consumed with supremacy and has nuclear weapons? I mean, can this state even be reformed? I hope it can, but it's very, very grim. But regardless, I'm very grateful to people like Sarit doing the work to expose the reality, because without them, so many of these crimes would just never be known.
Right.
So it's very, very important what B'Tselem does.
And definitely go to usefulidiots.podcast.com to see the full interview with Sarit, where she reacts to a very disturbing podcast called Two Nice Jewish Boys, which they're not nice at all. And I think it really speaks to a level of societal rot that we're seeing in Israel right now.
All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. We thank you so much for joining us and for being a supporter, which again, you can do at usefulidiots.podcast.com. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiots.podcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.